said, "I'm innocent. I'm not guilty. I'm a decent man, the president of my country." He's being represented by attorney Barry Pollack, who represented WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. And Pollack has said there will be voluminous filings ahead of this trial to address whether it was legal even for the U.S. to capture the head of a sovereign state.
Nicolas Maduro has claimed he is a prisoner of war and still president of Venezuela after pleading not guilty to drug trafficking and other charges in his first appearance at a court in New York. The UN held an emergency security council earlier too. Here's what Secretary General Antonio Guterres had to say, with his Undersecretary Rosemary DiCarlo speaking at the meeting on his behalf.
Rules of international law have not been respected with regard to the 3 January military action. The Charter enshrines the prohibition of the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state.
Well, we also know at that Security Council that the US's Mike Waltz insisted there was no war going on, there was no ground warfare in Venezuela, and Russia and China both signalled their support for Venezuela. Let's speak to Daniela Cheslow. She's in the US. She's national security reporter for Politico, and we'll just digest some of the day's events so far. Daniela, a warm welcome. Good evening to you.
Thank you for having me.
Nicolas Maduro, then, former president of Venezuela, seized by the Trump administration, by the military, has been in court in the last couple of hours. What more do we know about that? What has he said?
He said, "I'm innocent. I'm not guilty. I'm a decent man, the president of my country." He's being represented by attorney Barry Pollack, who represented WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. And Pollack has said there will be voluminous filings ahead of this trial to address whether it was legal even for the U.S. to capture the head of a sovereign state.
OK, all right. His wife also in court, Maduro's wife also there as well. Has she had anything to add? Do we know what the next stage of this is?
She has also pled not guilty, so I'm sure this will be a lengthy legal wrangling, circulating not only on the charges that they're facing, but on the very nature of those charges and whether they apply.
Yeah, we also know that the UN Security Council's been meeting today. There are questions, aren't there, about whether the US has broken international law or not. And I wonder whether there is a unified answer coming out of the United States in terms of either members of Trump's administration, Republicans or beyond.
Among Republicans, you are seeing a largely unified response. We heard from the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, today that this was an operation, a law enforcement operation. That's something that we also heard over the weekend from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And there's also a lot of reference to the idea of the Monroe Doctrine. This is more than a century old, and this was a doctrine that the U.S. should project power in the Western Hemisphere and push out other countries, other nations that have designs on the area. Back then, it was against the United Kingdom or Britain. Today, it's against China, Iran. And so Mike Waltz said today in the UN, this is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. We're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors. And that line around the Monroe Doctrine is really something the president has seized upon, and so have his allies.
Just looking at a Reuters poll of US adults, over 1,200 of them released today. Public opinion says only 33% of respondents said they approve of the US military action to remove Maduro, while 34% said they do not. Another 33% said they don't know or skipped the option of the questionnaire. I mean, what broadly does the US public think about this? There are obviously many Latin Americans living in America, Marco Rubio being one of the most famous ones at the moment. He has long wanted to dig into Latin America with all sorts of issues, not just in his native Cuba, but in Venezuela, as we've been witnessing.
Yeah, and certainly my colleagues have been reporting, we had somebody who was in Florida for the winter holidays, and she captured a lot of just jubilant celebration among the Venezuelan diaspora in the U.S. at the deposing of Maduro, who was despised. But I think the question is really what comes next. I was talking to the office of Representative Don Bacon. He's a Republican from Nebraska, and he's retiring, so he doesn't have that much to lose. And he was saying he really supports the removal of Maduro, but he wants to see a role for the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, and he's worried about the role of oil in the U.S. plans for Venezuela. That is a line that you're not hearing from mainstream Republicans, and I think that's kind of a tension. We still don't really know what the plans are for Venezuela. For now, there's Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's vice president, who is going to be the interim leader, and it's not really clear if there will be elections afterward or not. Trump's allies certainly are saying this is just an interim. We will have elections afterward, but you can't change everything overnight. That's the big takeaway they're saying from Iraq and Afghanistan, nation-building projects that turned out to be extremely costly in both blood and treasure.
Yeah, it may be easy to, or fairly easy to overthrow a regime, but it's what comes afterwards that is the issue. The US State Department's just posted an image of Donald Trump on social media, overlaid with the words, "This is our hemisphere," I guess in reference to those Latin American countries. There are questions, coming from other Latin American nations, aren't there, about where Trump will end with this? There must be concern among communities.
Absolutely. The American administration has had quite an active social media presence. Over the weekend, I saw one FAFO, in other words, F around and find out. And that's really the administration's message, not only to Venezuela, but all around the Western Hemisphere. And I think for countries like Cuba, like Mexico, like Nicaragua, who are hearing these threats, they're wondering just how severely to take them. And certainly there's a sense that this is a presidency that's willing to take dramatic military measures in the Western Hemisphere and project power that way.
What is the appetite then for the US having more of a permanent role when it comes to Venezuela? The question about what comes next is important. They've been keen to stress, Mike Waltz today, keen to stress that you're not at war with Venezuela, but the US has intimated that Donald Trump has intimated that he wants to take control of the country.
Yeah, this was something that we saw a lot of ambiguity around over the weekend. Right after the strike, the president had a press conference in Mar-a-Lago, and he said, we're going to be running Venezuela. Then yesterday morning, Sunday, Marco Rubio, our Secretary of State, took to multiple TV programs and the Financial Times and Washington Post, saying the only thing we're running is the direction of Venezuela, and suggesting that there would be the U.S. giving sort of a guidance from Washington to Delcy Rodriguez, but not taking an active role. We don't know yet who's going to be in charge of running the U.S. side of the Venezuela operations. There was an idea that was floated in the Washington Post that perhaps White House advisor Stephen Miller could take on a more prominent role, but nothing in that is certain. And I've written to the White House asking for more clarity, and I certainly have not gotten any.
Yeah, and look, question of the US midterms as well. I think a lot of Americans would like Donald Trump to just return to purely domestic policy, although he will argue this is affecting Americans. The drug trade is affecting everyday Americans. So he sort of ropes this into his America First category, doesn't he?
Absolutely. And his allies do as well. Senator Tom Cotton, who's the Republican chair of the powerful Senate Intelligence Committee, put out a statement saying that taking down Maduro is important to his state of Arkansas, that there's a lot of people there who have had addiction to fentanyl, and that having the drug operations of Venezuela stopped by the deposing of Maduro is a boon to his state as well. And so that's a line that you're hearing a lot among Trump supporters, that this is not just about overseas adventures. This is about defending America's interests at home. I think it's noteworthy that Americans don't vote on foreign policy. They vote at home. Democrats are certainly trying to tie this to say Trump is having his headline-grabbing exercises in Latin America while healthcare is getting more expensive here. But it's not clear yet whether that message will resonate or whether people will feel energized by what it sees as, wins overseas, dramatic military operations that have certainly been lauded by both adversaries and allies of the president alike for their success. There were no American troops killed, although there were dozens of people in Venezuela who were killed in the attack. And I think we're still shaking out what this will mean. This is only the first days after the operation. What happens next? Who takes control? What it looks like? How much it costs the U.S.? All those questions are still not answered.
Look, thank you for being with us. Really appreciate it. Daniela Cheslow, national security reporter for Politico over in the US. US. Let's talk a little bit more about Donald Trump's plans for Venezuela and what the US might do next then with Bob McEwen. He's Chief Executive for the US Council for National Policy and former Republican Congressman for Ohio. Bob, a great pleasure to speak to you again. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Kate.
What do you think Donald Trump's long-term goal is here? What does he want to come away with eventually?
Well, I think that the allies, the Western Hemisphere, people will always go where the power is. And when there's no leadership from the West and the Chinese come in and they're buying off leaders and they're using it for their own benefit, leaders will go to what is in their best interest. And we saw the Chinese walk through Africa, and they're trying to move into Latin America. And by the United States standing up, you saw what the immediate reaction from all the other countries is. That finally, America's leading again. We want to be on the side of freedom. And I think that Trump is going to see that we can have stability once again and protect liberty.
Okay. I mean, I suppose the question raised by our previous reporter there was really whether, that Americans don't vote on foreign policy. They vote on issues closer to home. We've got the midterms coming up. Is there a concern, Bob, does there need to be a line drawn here about how many more conflicts Donald Trump wants to involve himself in, or how many more, globally relevant operations, albeit fairly close to home in this case, how much more he wants to get involved in terms of foreign policy before he starts to look like he's prioritising the American people instead, because many feel that his eyes and his priorities are elsewhere?
Well, that's certainly a good thought. And the effort has been, as you know, the key ingredients in any political race are peace and prosperity. And never in the history of man has a nation become the premier nation on earth, but what it didn't seek it. And it knew what it had to do to get there, whether it be the Greeks or the Romans or the French or the British for 250 years, except after World War II was thrust upon a nation that didn't seek it, didn't ask for it. And yet the United States, people look to it. Why doesn't the United States do something? And we see it year after year after year. You know, why doesn't the United States do something in Ukraine? Or why doesn't it do something in the Balkans? Or why didn't it do all of this? And the American people really, I know the rest of the world thinks that America likes doing that. The American people just despise it and wish that it would go away. And it's only when they constantly have been pressed and pressed and pressed that they finally react. Sort of the Churchill, the Americans will always do what the right thing after having used every other opportunity. And so Chavez this regime has been in control since 1999. They've become the tools of every rogue organization, the Iranians, Hezbollah, Chinese. They've given out diplomatic passports to all of these rogue thugs they've used the diplomatic protections to move drugs. And the United States did nothing until finally Donald Trump, in a phone conversation with Mr. Maduro last week, said, knock it off, put a stop to it, or we're going to put a stop to it. And he had the opportunity, could have gone to Turkey and lived in the benefits.
So he was asking, he was asking the former president of Venezuela to go or be removed. And we know that US special forces have been in Venezuela. This operation isn't just an overnight thing. It began in August. Certainly the intelligence officials were there in August. I mean, does it matter? Let's not say whether it is or isn't a breach of international law, but does it actually matter if it was a breach of international law?
Well, I suppose it certainly is. They wanted to do things by the book, and that is that he was indicted for 5 years. He was on the wanted list. Of course, the goal and the hope was that he would discontinue shipping it. And he did the alternative. Not only did he ship drugs, but he emptied his prisons and the insane asylums and gave them protection to come to the United States so that we would care for him. He's done everything. He literally walked up, spit in the American's eye, poked him in the eye, stabbed him, kicked him in the shins, did everything humanly possible to aggravate him until finally America just said, enough, all right, son. You're going to go to jail. And so that's where he is in prison.
Okay. All right. Is there any appetite, Bob, for US oil companies to get back into Venezuela? It's crude oil, it's hard to extract. We know, as you referenced, that actually China is the biggest backer, it is the biggest owner of Venezuelan oil interests in terms of external countries. So it's the biggest foreign investor in Venezuelan oil, China. Here, the US, if they want US oil companies to go back into Venezuela, A, they need the appetite for it, but also B, they are going to have to take on China. And that then represents another foreign intervention, another global fight to get into potentially.
No, okay, those are very, very good questions. I first of all will dismiss the Chinese part. China always talks tough, but whenever there's a conflict, they run and hide in the bushes. And so I don't think we're going to hear anything from China. But the ultimate question.
In fact, China has already spoken at the UN Security Council and called for the release of the former Venezuelan President Maduro.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to see and hear from them. As for them investing or putting any money or anything at risk in Venezuela, you're not going to hear it. You'll get plenty of words from the diplomatic corps, but you're nothing of significance. But the other question is, do people want to invest there? And I remember I was speaking for the president in Argentina. I remember that it was the third richest nation in the Western Hemisphere before Perón and the socialists came in and destroyed it. And the topic of conversation, I hope we have time for this. It'll take about 60 seconds for me to lay it out, but it applies to the same scenario. And that is that they were privatizing the telephone company. And I was meeting with these business people. I saw it was a topic in the newspaper. So I asked them, I said, are you going to invest?
business people, sorry. Malay's business people.
Who? I beg your pardon?
They were all president of Argentina. Are you saying?
Yeah, it was a dinner. It was a banquet.
Right.
And there were lots of business people there. And I said, "Are you going to invest in the telephone company?" And they all said, "No, we're not going to do that." I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "What they're going to do is take the money. The government's going to take the money, recapitalize it, and then once it's recapitalized, then they'll steal it back. They'll nationalize it again. We're not going to do that." I said, "Well, who would do such a thing?" He said, "Well, some insurance companies in Spain, some other folks are idiots, but they said our money all is in the United States where it's safe." So, nevertheless, they privatized it. They did all that. A few years later, I come walking in, and the Economist magazine is laying on the counter. My wife points to it, and she circled a paragraph. And she said, "You'll want to read that." And so when I read the article, it says that indeed Argentina had nationalized the newly updated and improved telephone company in Argentina. So your question is, do people want to get back into Venezuela and do that? Socialism is theft. Socialism says if a person walks in and steals something out of your purse, that's called a criminal. If you get enough people to do it in a parliament and take the money out of your purse, that's called socialism. And people don't like it. It always leads to poverty. The greater the socialism, the greater the poverty.
Okay.
So now that they've taken the third richest nation on earth in the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela, turned it into the second poorest in the Western Hemisphere, the question is, do people want to go back into that? That's going to take some assurance and encouragement from the United States and freedom-loving people. But I'll say this, 8 million Venezuelans returning home in order to roll up their sleeves and build a country. The possibility is there. They're good people.
Bob, thank you so much for being with us. Bob McEwen there, Chief Executive of the US Council for National Policy, former Republican Congressman for Ohio.